The wind cut through the small courtyard like a blade, and I shivered violently in my thin nightgown. Kelvin's voice still echoed in my ears. "Then go to your parents. Hope you freeze." My heart pounded, not only from the cold, but from the shock that the man I married could push me out of my own home. I reached for the doorknob, trying desperately, but it wouldn't budge. He had locked it from the inside. My fingers, stiff with frost, rattled against the metal. Panic rose in my chest, and I considered breaking the window to get back in, but the wind whipped at me, and I felt my legs trembling uncontrollably. That's when I saw her. Madame BC, the elderly woman who lived next door, came out of her house. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were kind, gentle, and steady. She didn't scold me or ask questions. She simply gestured for me to come over. I stumbled toward her, teeth chattering, feeling a strange mixture of shame and relief. As soon as I stepped inside her warm living room, she wrapped a thick blanket around my shoulders and sat me by the fireplace. The heat was almost unbearable after the biting cold, and for the first time since Kelvin's outburst, I felt my muscles relax. Madame BC poured a cup of hot tea and handed it to me without saying a word. I cradled it in my hands, grateful for even the smallest comfort. Her home smelled of old wood and something sweet, like cinnamon and baked bread. She sat across from me, her hands folded calmly in her lap, and finally spoke in her gentle, steady voice. "Ada, you should rest here tonight. Tomorrow you will see why this is important. You do not need to face him alone." I blinked at her, confused and wary. Why are you helping me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Madame BC's lips curved slightly, almost as if she had been waiting for this question. "My son is your husband's boss. He respects me and he listens when I speak. You will see, Ada. Tomorrow your husband will have to answer for his actions." I held the blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring into the flames as the heat slowly thawed my frozen fingers. Fear and anger mingled inside me, a heavy weight that I could not lift. Yet, in this quiet, simple room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. For the first time that night, I realized that maybe I wasn't completely alone in facing Kelvin's harsh temper. Madame BC poured herself a cup of tea and sat quietly beside me, as if her presence alone could shield me from the storm outside. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the panes, but inside, for a brief moment, the world felt calm. I sipped my tea, feeling warmth spread from my hands to my chest, and silently thanked her for not letting me face the freezing night alone. That night, I realized that help could come from the most unexpected places. And though my heart was heavy with hurt, I finally had a plan for surviving not just the night, but whatever came after. The morning sun streamed weakly through the curtains, but the warmth it brought could not chase away the heaviness I felt in my chest. I was still wrapped in Madame BC's thick blanket, sipping the last of the hot tea, my mind replaying the events of the night. Kelvin's anger, sudden and harsh, still burned behind my eyes. I tried to understand how a man who once whispered love in the dark could push me into the freezing cold like that. Before that night, life with Kelvin had been ordinary on the surface. He worked hard, I supported him, and we shared small moments of laughter. But cracks had been forming quietly over the years, almost invisible until they suddenly split the foundation of our home. He had always been proud, fiercely proud, and it showed in small ways. His insistence on having things his way, the way he spoke to others, the sharpness of his tone when things did not go perfectly. At first, I excused it. I told myself he was stressed, tired from work, or simply struggling. But the stress never passed, and I began to notice a pattern. The louder he shouted, the smaller I became. I remembered the morning he accused me of burning his breakfast because I had left the stove on for a moment too long. He slammed his fist on the counter, his face red, and demanded I apologize. I had apologized, of course, though the mistake was minor and unintentional. Then there was the day he raged over a misplaced key, yelling that I was careless and unreliable. These moments were peppered throughout our marriage, each one small enough to be forgiven, but frequent enough to hurt. Madame B.C. listened as I spoke softly to myself, her presence grounding me. She had always been kind to neighbors, offering advice without judgment, and that calm wisdom now gave me strength I had almost forgotten I possessed. "You've tried to hold everything together," she said quietly, "and yet he never notices. That is not weakness on your part. It is his blindness." I thought of the evenings when Kelvin would come home, exhausted from work, but not too tired to find fault in my cooking, my cleaning, or the way I folded the laundry. I thought of the holidays he spent worrying about appearances rather than family. And I realized something that had been buried under years of fear. I had been living to avoid his anger, not living for myself. That morning, wrapped in warmth, I began to understand the subtle ways I had allowed his temper to define my life. The fear that had controlled me, the fear that one wrong word could ignite his rage, was something I no longer wanted to let dictate my actions. I wanted more than survival. I wanted dignity, and perhaps even the chance to be seen and respected again. As I stared out the window at the frost glinting in the early light, I knew that the winter night was not just a moment of humiliation. It was also a turning point. Something had shifted in me, quietly, but irreversibly. And though I could not yet imagine the steps ahead, I felt the tiniest flicker of courage that would guide me toward the choices I would soon have to make. Kelvin's anger at home was never just about me. I had started noticing that something else always seemed to simmer beneath his harsh words and sudden outbursts, a pressure he carried with him from work. He rarely spoke about it, and when he did, he claimed it was nothing. But the tired lines around his eyes and the restless tapping of his fingers told a different story. I had no idea at the time just how much his job weighed on him, or how tightly it controlled his behavior. It started with small hints. Late nights at the office, hushed phone calls in the kitchen, and sudden bursts of frustration when he thought I wasn't paying attention. He would mutter under his breath, pacing, clutching his coat as if it were a shield. Once, I overheard him on the phone, voice tense, agreeing with something I couldn't hear. Later, he came home and snapped at me for something trivial, a dish left in the sink or a shirt folded the wrong way. At first, I thought it was just his temper, but slowly a pattern became clear. The more pressure he faced at work, the harsher he became at home. I also began noticing letters and messages from his company, which he kept tucked in his drawer. They weren't cheerful notices or casual memos. They were warnings, reminders, and requests for him to improve his performance. I realized then that Kelvin wasn't just angry. He was scared. Scared of failure, scared of disappointing his boss. And I was the nearest target for all that fear, the one he could control when everything else seemed out of control. One evening, he came home after a particularly long day. I asked him if he had eaten, and he snapped immediately. "Why are you asking? Don't you have anything else to do?" His voice was sharp, trembling with more than just anger. I tried to stay calm, offering a small explanation, but it only made him louder. He accused me of interfering, of not understanding the responsibilities he carried. And then, after a moment of silence, he stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door so hard that the wall shook. That was the night I started to feel the full weight of his hidden pressures. He was not just cruel by choice. He was overwhelmed, desperate, and too proud to admit it. But his pride did not excuse his actions, nor did it protect me from the cold, harsh reality of his temper. I realized I could no longer ignore the signs. Something had to change. Even as I helped him, spoke calmly, and tried to ease his tension, I began to see the truth. I could not carry his burdens for him. I had my own life, my own dignity to preserve. And slowly, a thought formed in the back of my mind. That one day I would need help from someone who could stand beside me, someone who could make him face the consequences of his actions. By the end of that evening, I felt a quiet determination building inside me. The cracks in our relationship were no longer invisible. They were raw, obvious, and impossible to ignore. And I knew that what had happened in the winter night, the push, the lockout, the freezing cold, was only the beginning of the lessons Kelvin would need to learn. The morning air was crisp, the kind that stung your cheeks and made every breath feel sharp. I woke early, determined to make the house feel calm and warm, even though tension hung heavy in the rooms. Kelvin had already left for work, or at least that's what I thought. I prepared breakfast quietly, moving like a shadow through the kitchen. I didn't want to start an argument. I simply wanted the house to run smoothly, hoping that perhaps, just perhaps, today could pass without shouting. But Kelvin's presence was everywhere, even when he wasn't speaking. When he returned from a short errand, his coat dripping with snow, he immediately found something to complain about. "Why is the floor wet?" he snapped, glaring at the small puddle I hadn't noticed. I explained that it must have been snow melting from his shoes, but he didn't want to hear it. "Always something, isn't it?" he muttered, his tone sharp, restless. I swallowed my frustration and offered a quiet apology, but it barely touched him. As the day went on, his anger grew heavier, weighing down every small action I took. He accused me of misplacing his wallet, of leaving the dishes out too long, and even of not preparing his coat properly. I tried to stay calm, to remind myself that none of these accusations were true, but the constant barrage of criticism began to wear me down. My patience, carefully built over years of small compromises, was beginning to fray. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I had been tidying the living room when Kelvin returned from work earlier than expected. He slammed the door behind him, snowflakes scattering across the floor, and immediately raised his voice at me. "I can't stand it anymore," he shouted. "You don't even think about me. You don't care." His chest heaved, his face red with anger. I tried to reason with him, to tell him calmly that I had only wanted the house to be ready for him, but every word I spoke seemed to ignite him further. Then came the moment that changed everything. One small, careless comment from me, just a suggestion about dinner, set him off completely. Without warning, he grabbed my arm and pushed me toward the door. Before I could step back, he yanked it open and forced me outside. The cold hit me like a wall. My nightgown offered no protection against the biting wind, and my bare feet numbed instantly on the frozen ground. He locked the door behind me without a second thought and walked away, leaving me alone in the dark, shivering and stunned. I stood there for a moment, feeling disbelief mixed with fear. The world was white and cold, the sky dark, and the air sharp against my skin. I wanted to scream, to break the window, to demand he let me back in. But the chill stole my strength. My teeth chattered uncontrollably. And then I saw her. Madame Bisi, the neighbor whose kindness I had sometimes overlooked, standing in her doorway with a warm coat in her hands. "Come inside," she said softly, her eyes full of concern. "You don't belong out here." I didn't hesitate. I stumbled toward her, grateful beyond words for her presence, for her warmth, for someone finally seeing the fear and hurt that had been trapped inside me for so long. That night, I realized that even in the coldest moments, kindness could be a lifeline, and that perhaps the world still had people who could stand beside me when I needed them most. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly into Madame BC's living room. The warmth of the fire and the calm presence of the elderly woman made me feel safe for the first time in weeks. I wrapped the blanket tightly around my shoulders, sipping tea, and tried to steady my racing heart. Last night's events were still vivid. The shove, the freezing cold, the shock of being locked out. But now, in this quiet room, I felt a new clarity. I realized that my life could not continue under the weight of fear, and that someone I trusted could help me reclaim a sense of dignity. Madame BC's son arrived mid-morning. He was calm, tall, and commanding, yet there was a softness in his eyes as he looked at me. I explained everything: the shouting, the constant criticisms, the small accusations that had grown into a pattern of fear, and finally, the winter night when Kelvin pushed me outside. I expected judgment or lecture, but he listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. Each word seemed to weigh heavily on him, and I could tell he understood both the severity of Kelvin's actions and the courage it took for me to speak. When Kelvin arrived, expecting his usual morning scolding or breakfast ready on time, he froze. His boss, Madame BC's son, was standing in the living room with me. The change in Kelvin's face was immediate. For the first time, his pride faltered, and I could see fear flash in his eyes. He stammered, trying to explain, but the calm, unwavering presence of his boss left no room for excuses. Every accusation he had made the night before, every harsh word, every shove, they were no longer hidden behind the walls of our home. The conversation that followed was measured but firm. Kelvin was reminded of the responsibilities he carried, not just at work, but at home. His anger, which had so often been his way of controlling the world, was confronted directly. He realized for the first time that his fear and pride were not admirable. They were destructive. And I realized for the first time that I did not need to endure his temper silently. My voice, finally heard by someone who mattered, became my shield. After the discussion, Madame BC's son left, assuring me that Kelvin would be monitored and supported in learning to control his anger. Kelvin, left alone with me, was quiet. The man who had once pushed me into the freezing night now stood humbled, aware of the consequences of his actions. I didn't rush to forgive him, but I recognized the first step in a new beginning, one where fear would no longer dictate my life. That day, I understood the power of unexpected allies, the importance of courage, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for oneself. The winter night that had seemed like the end of everything had instead become a turning point. With Madame BC's guidance and her son's support, I felt a sense of hope returning. I was no longer just surviving. I was reclaiming my life, one careful, determined step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I looked at the world and felt that maybe, just maybe, warmth could follow the coldest nights. That winter night felt like the lowest point of my life, but it turned out to be the moment that changed everything. I realized I didn't have to live in fear, that my voice mattered, and that support could come from the most unexpected places. Madame BC's kindness and her son's presence gave me the strength to stand tall and demand respect, not with anger, but with courage. Kelvin faced the consequences of his actions, and I finally felt free from the weight of his temper. The fear that had controlled me for so long began to fade, replaced by hope, dignity, and the understanding that I deserved better. That day, I learned that even the coldest nights can lead to a new beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories of courage, revenge, and unexpected twists. Your support helps me bring more real-life drama and emotional stories to life.